Good evening from New York. I'm Chris Hayes. As we here in America struggle to uphold our own democratic institutions, there is a situation playing out in South Korea right now that is remarkably relevant, disturbing, and maybe at this hour, quite hopeful. The remarkable scene you may have seen throughout the day unfolding over just the last 24 hours, where citizens of South Korea have taken to the streets to defend democracy against an erratic far-right president who declared martial law. That president would be Yoon Suk-yeol. It's a story that might sound in some ways familiar to you. A political novice who ran for president in 2022, thanks to high inflation and frustration with his liberal predecessor, Yoon narrowly won that election by just about 0.25% of all votes cast. He identified as an anti-feminist, made a point of courting the South Korean male vote, the sort of manosphere that exists over there, with an openly misogynistic campaign that blamed feminism for the country's low birth rates. As president, he tried to dismantle the government's gender equity agency. He also tried to raise the country's maximum weekly working hours from 52 to 69 a week, which you can imagine was deeply unpopular. It's funny how right-wing populists always sort of get around to that kind of stuff, huh? He also tried to push through reforms of the country's medical system that led to months of mass strikes by doctors and nurses. And, you'll never guess, he and his family got embroiled in a bunch of scandals, including allegations of accepting improper gifts. Also a kind of through line. Now, the upshot was that in parliamentary elections this spring, the highest turnout for a South Korean election since the 20th century, the opposition party won in a landslide, and that left Yoon's party holding just a third of the country's National Assembly. Amid all that, Yoon's approval rating fell to an abysmal 17% earlier this month. He and many of his government allies faced impeachment efforts. He was talked about as a lame duck president, which made his declaration yesterday all the more shocking. Yoon made a speech to the nation overnight, full of sort of Trumpian inflection, saying, quote, "I declare emergency martial law to defend the Free Republic of Korea from the threats of North Korean communist forces and to eradicate the shameless pro-North Korean anti-state forces that are plundering the freedom and happiness of our people and to protect the free constitutional order. Through this emergency martial law, I will rebuild and defend the Free Republic of Korea, which is falling into ruin. To this end, I will surely eradicate the criminals of the anti-state forces who have been committing atrocities so far." The Army general Yoon put in charge then issued the declaration of martial law. And if you were wondering what that looks like in the democratic country of South Korea, quote, "All political activities, including the operations of the National Assembly, local councils, political parties, political associations, assemblies, and demonstrations are strictly prohibited. All media and publications will be subject to the control of the martial law command. Strikes, work slowdowns, and gatherings that incite social disorder are forbidden. All medical professionals, including resident doctors currently on strike or absent from medical duties, must return to their work and perform their responsibilities within 48 hours. Violators will be dealt with under martial law." I mean, just straight up dictatorship, right? A dictatorial power grab. Like, we ban all politics henceforth. Nothing in civil society can happen, right? Single-handedly revoking freedom of speech and freedom of assembly, freedom of movement, the freedom to strike. And all of this happening in a country where memories of authoritarian rule are fresh. This is a democratic country because its people fought for that democracy. After a series of authoritarian regimes in the post-World War II era, post-Korean War era, a military coup swept South Korea in 1980.
South Korea is under full martial law after a week of student violence and what the official announcement called North Korean movements. Minutes after the announcement, the martial law command closed the schools, banned political activity, and arrested several well-known dissidents, including the head of South Korea's major political party.
You see the through line there, right? Of course, the North Korean menace, the sort of threat of communist infiltration and fifth columnists. And in 1980, the coup plotters smashed protesters, established a one-party state that lasted until free elections in 1987, brought down through street protest, basically. And after Yoon's martial law announcement last night, well, South Koreans, on a dime, in the middle of the night, decided they were not going back. People immediately took to the streets in the freezing cold of night in their parkas, all ages. And they did not just protest for the sake of protesting. They had a very specific goal in mind. You see, the country's legislature could block Yoon's martial law decree with a simple majority vote. But Yoon's declaration banned political activities, and he sent soldiers to the National Assembly building, basically their capital, right, to enforce the ban and to block lawmakers from getting inside the building for a quorum where they could have a vote. And so what do? You get visuals like this, as civilian protesters teamed up with those lawmakers who rushed to the Capitol to help them scale the Capitol building and get inside to cast their votes. It was, as one commentator on social media put it, a reverse January 6th, right? Breaking into the Capitol to vote to save democracy, working together to get the National Assembly to vote to overrule martial law. And it worked. Within 3 hours of Yoon's speech, a quorum of lawmakers, I believe 190 of them, got into the building. They forced a vote to reject his martial law declaration. A unanimous vote, as the AP noted. All 190 lawmakers who participated in the vote supported the lifting of martial law. Immediately after that vote, television footage showed soldiers who'd been stationed at Parliament leaving the site. And 6 hours after he declared martial law as the sun rose over Seoul, President Yoon Suk-yeol backed down. Not bad. Maybe not. He lifted his order. The protesters are celebrating. Many are calling for Yoon to resign or be impeached. In fact, the opposition party is drawing up impeachment articles, we understand, at this moment. Now, I've been transfixed by these developments all day long. I don't know if you have as well. I mean, incredible stuff. Exciting, inspiring, energizing to watch everyday Koreans. I mean, all ages. People, I think, from what I could tell from the reporting, whose politics were really kind of all over the place, come out to stand up for democracy. Grandmas in their parkas in freezing temperatures, standing up to armed soldiers in their faces, literally pushing their lawmakers to pass a law saving their democratic institutions. And all to resist this far-right misogynist president who won by the skin of his teeth and decided he had a mandate to make over the country in his image, even as he frittered away all his political capital and grew historically unpopular. It's a different country, different constitution, different traditions. I think there's a lesson there for us, right, Americans in 2024. Crucially, a reminder that in the end, the last bulwark of democracy, the people themselves, working with and through an elected opposition unafraid to do the right thing.
Well, exactly 2 weeks ago at this very hour, I had seen enough of what was happening to Matt Gaetz's nomination for Attorney General in the United States Senate to declare with confidence right here that Matt Gaetz would not, could not be confirmed, wasn't going to happen. And just 2 days later, Donald Trump then withdrew Matt Gaetz's nomination for Attorney General. And tonight, Pete Hegseth's confirmation for Secretary of Defense has now hit the same wall in the United States Senate that blocked the Gaetz nomination. Pete Hegseth is not going to be confirmed for Secretary of Defense. It's all over. If we're on the same schedule we were on with the Matt Gaetz nomination, that means Donald Trump will give up on Pete Hegseth on Thursday. As I explained here last night, it only takes one Republican on the Senate Armed Services Committee to kill the Hegseth nomination in that committee. I also pointed out that that committee has 2 Republican women who will be the first senators to vote on the Hegseth nomination in that committee. And NBC News is now reporting that one of those women is now planning to make that a very, very difficult confirmation hearing for Pete Hegseth if he somehow dares to show up for that 2 months from now. NBC News broke the news today of the number of Senate Republicans who are not supporting the Hegseth nomination. It only takes 4 Senate Republicans added to all the Democrats to defeat any Republican nomination on the Senate floor in the full Senate vote. And NBC News is reporting as many as 6 Senate Republicans, perhaps more, are currently not comfortable supporting Hegseth's bid to lead the Pentagon as new revelations about the former Fox News anchor's past continue to be made public. And you can be absolutely sure that there will be no information about Pete Hegseth coming out that will make any senators more comfortable in supporting his nomination. NBC News reports Senator Joni Ernst, Republican of Iowa, who sits on the Armed Services Committee, would not commit to supporting Hegseth's nomination and said she planned to grill the former cable news host about news accounts of his alleged alcohol abuse, mistreatment of women, and financial mismanagement. We're just going to have a really frank and thorough conversation, Ernst said of Hegseth's nomination process. Pete Hegseth cannot survive a really frank and thorough conversation. That is Republican Senator Joni Ernst's way of saying Hegseth doesn't have a chance. It may be that the only thing we're waiting for is for Donald Trump to decide who his next choice for Secretary of Defense will be before he gets rid of Pete Hegseth. Last night, in an interview with Rachel Maddow, Jane Mayer, who delivered career-ending reporting for The New Yorker about Pete Hegseth career-ending reporting for The New Yorker on Sunday about his public drunkenness and abuse of women, said there is probably much more to come.
It's been almost a day since this story came out, and my phone has been ringing off the hook. I have been hearing from many more people who worked with Pete Hegseth who have come out of the woodwork to say they, too, have stories along the same lines.
They, too, have stories along the same lines. Some of those people who worked with Pete Hegseth came out of the woodwork to tell NBC News about just how drunk you can be hosting a Fox morning show. NBC News reports Pete Hegseth, President-elect Donald Trump's pick for Defense Secretary, drank in ways that concerned his colleagues at Fox News, according to 10 current and former Fox employees who spoke with NBC News. 2 of those people said that on more than a dozen occasions during Hegseth's time as a co-host of Fox and Friends Weekend, which began in 2017, they smelled alcohol on him before he went on air. Those same 2 people, plus another, said that during his time there, he appeared on television after they'd heard him talk about being hungover as he was getting ready or on set. One of the sources said they smelled alcohol on him as recently as last month and heard him complain about being hungover this fall. Everyone would be talking about it behind the scenes before he went on the air. One of the former Fox employees said 3 current employees said that his drinking remained a concern up until Trump announced him as his choice to run the Pentagon, at which point Hegseth left Fox. 1 current and 2 former Fox employees said they felt like they needed to babysit Hegseth due to his drinking and late nights. We'd have to call him to make sure he didn't oversleep because we knew he'd be out partying the night before, one of them said. Hegseth drank heavily at some social events with Fox News colleagues as well, according to 2 former employees, with one of the former colleagues saying he would get absolutely wasted. For the sake of national security, I really hope he has stopped drinking. One of the former Fox employees said he should not be Secretary of Defense. Another former Fox employee said his drinking should be disqualified. Absolutely wasted is now an accurate 2-word description of Pete Hegseth's nomination to be Secretary of Defense. Fox did not respond to NBC News requests for comments. A spokesperson for the Trump transition team added credibility to the allegations by calling the allegations, quote, completely unfounded and false. Every single spokesperson who has ever worked for Donald Trump has repeatedly engaged in public lying. So the presumption about any statement from a Trump spokesperson should be that it is a lie. Every Trump spokesperson, including Donald Trump, has earned that presumption. Pete Hegseth's lawyer, who is far less comfortable with public lying, declined to comment. Here is Pete Hegseth today, going door to door, desperately trying to talk to senators in the Russell Senate office building, but refusing to have that really frank and thorough conversation that Senator Joni Ernst wants to have with him.
Eddie, can you respond to any of these allegations of misconduct? Are senators concerned at all about drinking? There's a new report saying that you were seen drinking while you were coming to work.
Folks, we've had a good set of meetings today with senators, talk about Secretary-Designate's vision, what the president wants at the Department of Defense, part of an integrated strategy the next term, and we'll continue to have conversations with senators as they deal with their questions.
Do you ever come to work Senators asking you about any of these allegations? Have you heard from Senator Wicker at all about the reports?
Every one of those flags that he walked by were flags in front of the door of a United States senator whose door was closed to Pete Hegseth. That is an awful long way to walk in the Russell Senate office building between meetings with senators who would normally be very eager to speak to a nominee for Secretary of Defense. And I mean senators from both parties. And remember, on that walk 2 weeks ago today, when Matt Gaetz was doing that walk, J.D. Vance was proudly and smilingly walking at Matt Gaetz's side, walking around the Senate with him. It was a parade of clowns. They were full of smiles and confidence publicly, but as I said that night, they were obviously the walking dead in the United States Senate that day. And if you're wondering just how dead the Hegseth nomination is, today, J.D. Vance was Senator J.D. Vance. Remember, he has one of those offices in one of those buildings. Senator J.D. Vance was nowhere to be seen when Pete Hegseth became the dead man walking through the Senate hallways.
But we begin tonight with President Biden, who was not in the U.S. today, but rather at the National Museum of Slavery in Angola, addressing the origin story of America and slavery.
Cruel, brutal, dehumanizing, our nation's original sin. While history can be hidden, it cannot and should not be erased. It should be faced. It's our duty to face our history.
It is a reminder that President Biden is a politician from an era that will very soon be gone. In 48 days, Biden will no longer be president, and with it, the era of presidents like him may dissolve completely. It is an era where leaders of perhaps the world's least humble nation showed some humility on the world stage. Early into his presidency, Barack Obama addressed the horrors of slavery and segregation while speaking in Cairo, Egypt. Though he later rejected it, Bill Clinton considered making an official domestic apology to African Americans for slavery. Even George W. Bush acknowledged slavery's continuing legacy in American life and the need to confront that legacy. These lessons on civility and humility, lessons that stretch back to Abraham Lincoln, will no longer be shown from a U.S. leader. because the next president has been a flat-out bully his whole life and on the world stage, a tyrant, a thug. And when he is inaugurated next month, the world will be very different because of it. It will be the end of Pax Americana and it will be replaced by the entry of global gangsterism in grotesque display. Late last night, we learned that Donald Trump will attend the reopening celebration for Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris this weekend, his first foreign trip since the election. France, as it were, is a prime example of the creeping autocracy so reflected by MAGA. Far-right and some would say fascist-curious Marine Le Pen is looking to link up with a far-left party to take over the country. We are in the age of global gangsterism, the age folks like Vladimir Putin have planned for decades. Look at this map. It reflects an alarming worldwide trend on the rise in autocracy. These are the countries who had elections this year based on their democracy grade by The Economist. Those colored in blue are authoritarian. Those colored in yellow are hybrid regimes. And those colored in red, including the United States, are deemed flawed democracies. You don't see South Korea on that map because The Economist considers it a full democracy. But check out what's happening in South Korea. President Yoon Suk-yeol of South Korea declared martial law late Tuesday, inciting political chaos within one of our closest allies in Asia. President Yoon has accused opposition parties of sympathizing with North Korea and controlling parliament. Soldiers blocked large crowds from entering the parliament building, even as lawmakers inside voted to block Yoon's decree. While inside, South Korean opposition party staff set up barricades to prevent soldiers from entering the chamber. Does this seem familiar? But then on Wednesday morning, their time, so not too long ago, President Yoon lifted the emergency martial law declaration that he had imposed, bowing to pressure from lawmakers and protesters. The tumultuous 6 hours recalled the country's dark pre-democracy period, because South Korea also has had a dark pre-democracy past, which includes martial law imposed there 16 times since the end of World War II, most recently in 1980 after the assassination of military strongman Park Chung-hee the year before. That past doesn't feel as ancient as it once did, there or in many other parts of the world. We are seeing a global trend of the far right surging. It isn't just happening here. But let's bring you back to the U.S. and to our local gangster, Donald Trump. He's not even president yet, and he's already spending his time sitting in his golden palace, Mar-a-Lago, muscling other countries like he's Tony Soprano with a social media site. Doing things like, reportedly, debating whether or not to invade Mexico, threatening BRICS countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, with 100% tariffs if they don't commit to trading in dollars and not their own currencies. Demanding Hamas release all hostages being held in Gaza before his inauguration, or there will be, quote, all hell to pay in the Middle East. Even reportedly threatening Canada. According to Fox, when Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau went to Mar-a-Lago this weekend to try to talk Trump out of his 25% tariff threat, Trump apparently suggested that if Canada can't handle the tariffs that would violate the NAFTA upgrade Trump himself signed into law, the USMCA, they should just become the 51st state. Just become this 51st state instead and allow Trudeau to be reduced to governor of the state of Canada, which caused the prime minister and others to laugh nervously. And while some are writing that off as just a joke, just a few hours ago, Trump posted this obviously AI photo of him standing on a mountaintop next to the Canadian flag, looking off into the distance with the caption, "Oh, Canada." And for the record, he appears to be looking at the Matterhorn, which is on the border between Switzerland and Italy, not Canada. Oh, and let's not forget, this is the same Donald Trump who at one point seriously wanted to buy the nation of Greenland, even possibly trade it for Puerto Rico. I wonder what this guy has against Puerto Rico. I'll just keep noodling on it. I'm sure I'll figure it out. Bottom line. This is how Trump operates on the world stage. He acts like he's everybody's boss, like he's the king of the world, which is bad news for basically everybody, unless your name is Vladimir Putin, the boss to Trump's underboss. The question now is, will any other leader stand up to him? And who? Who becomes the leader of the free world when Donald Trump ends Pax Americana as we know it? As Nicholas Grossman writes for The Bulwark, there is no undoing damage in history. It is up to those with power and influence to limit it now, and up to future generations to deal with it later. The post-Cold War international system has serious flaws, but at least there are clear enough rules that charges of hypocrisy mean something. Even rules more honored in the breach will be preferable to the lawlessness Trump's second term could invite. The aforementioned Nicholas Grossman joins me now. He's an international relations professor at the University of Illinois and editor of Arc Digital. Also joining me is Bobby Ghosh, senior editor at Bloomberg. Thank you both for being here. Nicholas, I do want to start with you. Your piece was really excellent. It kind of sparked this open tonight. There are a lot of things you could actually criticize about the whole rules-based order after World War II. It favored the West over what's now called the Global South, what we used to call the Third World. It allowed the West to take resources from some of the countries that are now called BRICS or that are aligned with BRICS and use them for our own interests rather than theirs. There's a lot of things you could complain about. But it was a rule-based order that, in your writing, diminished wars, made the world safer. So what does it mean when Donald Trump breaks that order, ends it, and makes it a multipolar world, which is what Vladimir Putin has always wanted?
Well, it means that we risk going back to something that pretty much nobody alive in America has a memory of, which was before there was this bedrock of American power upon which a lot of these international rules were built. So think about things like open trade, which helped to avoid another Great Depression, of the big alliances of democracies like NATO and the U.S.-South Korea alliance, relationship with Japan or Australia or other countries, and that kept a lot of aggressive war at bay because a lot of the world knew there was a bedrock idea of when you try to, say, redraw borders by force, so you try to threaten an American ally, that then you're going to have to mess with the world's biggest power. And Trump is likely to take the U.S. away from that. And it actually won't be all that difficult because it doesn't really require doing anything. It just mostly requires not doing something, such as not helping a NATO ally that is being menaced by Russia, or not helping Ukraine anymore try to keep its independence.
Right. And, you know, Bobby, the couple of things that Nicholas mentioned are some of the things that are causing the world to sort of veer right? Like people don't like open trade, right? Free trade for a lot of Americans is the great evil. And Donald Trump lied and pretended he was going to end the NAFTA agreement, which, you know, eliminated tariffs between the United States, Canada, and Mexico and made us a free trade zone. People felt, well, that just meant jobs went to Mexico. They went to the cheaper place where people can be paid less. And people think about things like supporting NATO and supporting Ukraine, and they say, we don't want you to do that. We want you to just spend the money here. So Trump and a lot of other these far-right people, the Marine Le Pens, all of these people are out there making an argument that the rules-based order is hurting working people. And so they're choosing dictators. You know, it's a very confounding system, but it seems to be all over the world. We have a map here that shows all the places where people are veering toward autocrats. Your thoughts?
Yeah, that is true. And these autocrats, as you say, have done a very good job of misrepresenting what free trade means to ordinary people. Free trade to ordinary people, they've said, means your jobs go away. They don't point out. And by the way, the other side of the argument could make a stronger argument, and they clearly haven't been able to do so for a variety of reasons, that free trade means you can afford more things. Things are cheaper. You can buy a cheaper car. You can buy your cheaper things to furnish your home. Your home itself is cheaper to build because of free trade, because the world is full of places where things can be made cheaper, whereas your economy can focus on high value and high-end items and sort of technological superiorities where you can place the bets for your economic future. That argument has not properly been articulated, or at least has not been articulated afresh, and that's something that has been lacking in the public discourse. Nobody is reminding people, or nobody's doing a good enough job of reminding people that free trade brings all these benefits. These alliances that we have with these countries, NATO, benefits America. It doesn't just benefit those European countries. This narrative that, oh, those countries are free riding on us. It's a deeply flawed narrative. And the argument against it is because of NATO, we avoided a third world war. And because of NATO, still the chances of a third world war look remote. If NATO breaks out, then that possibility becomes much more real. And guess who's going to have to deal with that third world war, and who will be affected by it, and who in the end will have to go in and help.
You say they've weaponized the Justice Department, they weaponized the FBI. Would you do the same if you're reelected?
Well, he's unleashed something that we've all known about this for 100 years. We've watched other countries do it. But if they want to follow through on this, it could certainly happen in reverse. It could certainly happen in reverse.
Last year, Donald Trump suggested that he absolutely would use the FBI and the Justice Department to attack his political enemies if he was reelected. Well, 48 days from now, Trump will have the ability to do just that. Given this reality, this weekend, President Biden announced that he had pardoned his son Hunter. And today, there are calls on the president to extend his pardon powers to protect Trump's perceived enemies. Paul Rosenzweig argues in The Atlantic that President Biden must pardon Trump's critics now. President Biden has a moral obligation to do what he can for patriotic Americans who have risked it all. Joining me now is the author, Paul Rosenzweig, former Deputy Assistant Secretary for Policy in the Department of Homeland Security during the George W. Bush administration. It's great to have you tonight, sir. I'm eager to hear about your own sort of personal evolution on this, because I know in 2017 you argued we defend norms by defending norms, not preaching them. A lot has happened between now and then, and I wonder how you're thinking about the president's pardon power today and how he should wield it.
Well, back in 2017, I thought that Trump was an aberration, an unusual and black swan, if you will. And my thought was that you had to defend the norms of the rule of law, good governance, and the only way to do that was to maintain them even in the face of his aberrational behavior. Today, I think we know that Trump is not an aberration. He's a phenomenon. He's a movement. And as such, what we have to do is recalibrate how we respond to that. And it now strikes me as essential to at least begin to play to the edge of the field, right? To go as far as the law permits in combating the authoritarian excesses of Trump. And the way I wrote about in The Atlantic is the pardon power. A pardon for Hunter Biden, a pardon for Trump's critics would be completely normative breaking. And it would be out of character, out of historical tradition. But at this point, I was listening to your earlier broadcast. You were talking about Kash Patel. He's got a list of 60 people he wants to prosecute. That's a real list. Will he do all of them? I don't know. Will there be resistance at the FBI? Probably. But one of the realities of being investigated is that investigation has a cost, even if you're not prosecuted in the end. You have to hire a lawyer, the mental cost, the time, the resources. And so it strikes me as perfectly reasonable to ask, what can President Biden do within the bounds of law, even if it would not be normatively traditional, to save his allies from that? And the answer is obviously pardon them.
Yeah, I mean, it seems, and to you and I think to other folks as well, that the argument about institutional preservation in this moment is best relegated to academics, and that in reality, it's time to play political hardball. And it sounds like you're extending that not just to the pardon power, but to other levers that the Democrats might be able to pull. I'll read an excerpt from your Atlantic piece. It has become painfully self-evident that Democratic self-restraint is a form of unilateral disarmament that neither persuades Trump to refrain from bad behavior nor wins points among the undecided. It is time, well past time, for responsible Democrats to use every tool in their toolkit. Does any part of that, I guess, worry you? You know, I mean, one could have said the Democrats, when they were in control of the Senate, should have gotten rid of the filibuster and done stuff. Well, now it seems like the filibuster is the only thing that's actually going to stop Trump from enacting probably the broadest, most pernicious parts of his agenda. So how do you think about the cost-benefit analysis here?
Well, Of course it worries me. It has to. It has to worry any sensible thinking person to argue for breaching norms that have guided our country for 250 years. On the other hand, I don't think that democratic self-restraint is what is going to stop Trump from acting. If in the end, Trump and the Republican majority think that the filibuster is a barrier to whatever it is that they want, for example, they're going to get rid of it anyway, whether or not the Democrats had done so in the prior Congress. And so it strikes me as essential to begin trying to take steps that can't be reversed, or irreversible steps in defense of, say, voting rights, for example, expanding the franchise, guaranteeing federally against state interference. You know, you would still have to contend, obviously, with the Supreme Court. But for 2 years, the Democrats had a majority in both houses. And instead of doing transgressive normative things like changing the electoral rules to prevent Trump's cheating, they did normal democratic things. They passed the Inflation Reduction Act and the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act, and all good things, I'm sure, from their perspective. But they thought that that would be how to reclaim America, and turned out they were wrong.
Well, it is a deeply thought-provoking position you have taken and written about very articulately. It's great to have you on the show, Paul Rosenzweig. Thanks again for your time tonight.
Thanks for having me.
Bet you didn't hear about this one yet. The Washington Post is reporting that Donald Trump has offered the job of Deputy Defense Secretary to billionaire investor Steve Feinberg. A spokesman for Feinberg declined to say if he's accepted the potential nomination, and Trump aides say nothing is final until Trump announces it. But there are concerns about potential conflicts of interest. You don't know this guy, so I'm going to tell you about him. Back in 2017, Bloomberg reported, quote, through his $30 billion investment firm, Cerberus, Feinberg has bought companies that, ready for this, refuel spy planes, train Green Berets, make, as in produce, build sniper rifles, and watch America's foes from space. Okay, well, our nightcap is still here. Dan, you know Steve Feinberg. I mean, Cerberus has been one of the biggest investment firms on Wall Street for years and years. Donald Trump wanted to give him a huge job in the last administration. And there were so many conflicts of interest, it wasn't getting over. I remember when the huge Bloomberg expose came out, it was like, damn, he's never getting a job. We now live in a whole new world.
Yeah, I mean, Elon Musk, Vivek Ramaswamy, we can go back to Rex Tillerson, we can go back all the way to Dick Cheney. I mean, like these sorts of, I guess these conflicts of interest lie more with Republican administrations when you think about it, and maybe I'm just being selective.
Except he actually owns companies that sell basically
well, I mean, what's different?
AR-15s.
Yes. Yeah, Elon Musk. I mean,
yes.
It's Starlink, it's SpaceX, it's, subsidies for, electric vehicles. It's, a whole host of things. His relationship with China, they make half their cars in Shanghai, I mean, so think about these sorts of relationships. So I guess I'm less concerned with someone like this. When you think about a lot of the economic appointments that we've seen, I think a lot of folks feel pretty decent about them. If you had a Kash Patel running the national economics, or something like that, I mean, we'd be deeply worried. So when you look at Treasury, you look at what he might do as it relates to the Fed at some point in the next couple of years. I mean, some of these choices, I think we can look back to Mnuchin, Gary Cohn, and say, okay, that worked out okay. And that's a really important part of this whole mandate, because that's why we just talked about inflation and the like here. I mean, these are like adults in the room.
Scott Bessent, really strong pick. But let's talk about the politics of this, right? Steve Feinberg is going to be a controversial guy with conflict of interest. He'll be number 2, with the number 1 guy being Pete Hegseth. Can this administration sort of stomach multiple guys being controversial, newsworthy, news-making guys? At some point, you have to have people with senior jobs who just know how to get the trains running on time, know how government works.
Yeah, and in Trump's first administration, I think there was in calculations 3,400 conflicts of interest, right? We don't talk about that anymore, but it was real and is quite significant, and I don't imagine that it's going to change and probably get worse in this administration. I actually was thinking about when you mentioned Mike Bloomberg, because I worked on that third race, the controversial race, right? But I also remember that in 2005, him running for re-election, he got 47% of the black vote. And what was always interesting about Mike Bloomberg is that you may have disagreed with him on some policy, but he was very clear that he wanted to put good people in positions that actually cared about management. And he did. And I think that is to answer your question about Donald Trump, putting loyalists there is one thing, but putting loyalists there with no interest in serving the public is a whole other story. That if they're there to not only pay fealty to him, but also to extend their own ambitions, that's where it becomes problematic. And if you don't go to the FBI, go to any other sources of where people are actually going to look into your background and vet you, then all you're going to have are the Elon Musks of the world and all of these other wealthy folks actually enriching themselves and then enriching Donald Trump, and then essentially running the world. It's going to be like 4 people running the world.
But isn't that, but Mike Bloomberg is sort of the most extreme example, because Mike's one of his best qualities, right, is he picks the best teams, right? If you sit down mano a mano with Mike Bloomberg, he actually doesn't have Barack Obama magnetism or Bill Clinton. His magic is he surrounds himself with the highest quality, most talented people in the most important roles. And what you're looking at now is Trump picking his ultimate homeboys.
Well, I remember after 9/11, on his campaign, he was saying, you know what, I'm going to run the city in the many ways that I ran my business. We're going to be efficient. We're going to get the economy back up and running. You don't hear that from Donald Trump. There's no, I've heard the voter. I'm going to bring these people in to be responsive to the people that voted for me, and this is what they're going to do. That's what a normal politician, somebody that cares about public service, would actually say, and how they would deliver these picks. That's not what he's doing. He's bringing on people who would speak at the MSG rally. That's very different. That's a very different calculus here. And that's why I think, to your original question, you're going to see a lot of these types of conflicts and chaos because they're ego-driven, they're not people-driven. And that is the difference between someone who's really focused on loyalty and another who's focused on serving the public.
And I'm going to go back to those everyday voters. They're not really paying attention to conflict of interest, because I'm guessing they would say, aren't they all conflicted? Aren't they all corrupt?
100%. I was going to say, I don't think it's a matter of looking at this administration. I think when you go across the country, you have the privilege to have the job that I do for this network, for these networks, for this news organization, and get to meet people where they live and where they're at. This is not a new conversation for people. I think people look at people in Washington, D.C., all across the country, and say they do not reflect the lives that I have, the lives that we lead, what's happening in my community, the things that I care about day to day. Those people look like they have more influence, more power. And I know I'm speaking generally, but that's how people feel. That's how people feel. And so I think when they look at, and I'm not excusing any particular pick or deliberation about how people in this incoming administration or his last one were picked. Everybody should be looked at, on an individual basis. But that's just the fact of the matter about how people feel across the country. Washington, D.C. does not reflect the lives of the people that I get to go out and meet every 4 years.
And they're saying, maybe you don't like these new picks, but the world hasn't been working for me.
But for me, the question becomes, what is the measuring rod for success? And the reason I ask that is because with all of us having these different metrics by which we're judging a Donald Trump Part 2 presidency, it becomes much more difficult to critique the way that he is, to borrow you all's terms, flooding the zone with his loyalists. And the concern that I have is that by using improper metrics to measure his success, this becomes more and more normalized in a way where it's like, look, it was done before, this is normal practice now, and this is where our political space is headed and staying because it worked. But we don't know what working looks like. We don't know what it means because, again, we have these different measures around what success actually is. So I think it's important to understand, how are we actually judging the results that we will see?
Well, it's interesting you say that, because I've been thinking about that with respect to the pardon question. Because for the voter, is the voter going to see what Joe Biden did and say that this is just a man protecting his son? Because most people don't have issues with the merit of the cases. It's the fact that he said he wouldn't do it and then did it anyway. And and then when people comment on it,
and then when you compare that to all the things
But when folks comment and say he shouldn't have done it, and the Democrats should have, and the point is, that Democrats have lost the moral high ground. And that's why I go to your point, which is like, we've tried the moral high ground. Voters said, we don't believe you on the moral high ground. So what do we have, what do Democrats, what do folks have left to be able to say, you know what, this is the standard, and you have crossed that standard. You've either met it or you've gone far below it, but where is that actual standard?
But you can't have it both ways. And I think that's the real thing that people have to understand. You do not, at this point, if you want to say, look, Republicans have been in the mud, slinging mud, playing dirty this entire time, and now this is what we're going to do, that's fine. But you have to then abandon the argument about we are the protectors of democracy and American democratic institutions. You don't get to say we did it because they've been doing it for so long, and we are also somehow simultaneously concerned with the upholding of American democratic principles.